Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We have Dr. Christopher Streeter here today, and he's going to speak to you about motivating language theory and NCAA coaches' halftime communication. I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Brittany. It's great to be here. My name is Christopher Streeter. I'm an assistant professor of sport management at Nichols College here in Massachusetts. I'm thrilled to be here and grateful for the opportunity to share some of my research and findings with you folks. Just a brief backstory. Ever since I was a little boy, I grew up in locker rooms and on fields. My father was a boys varsity high school soccer coach for 33 years. And as a little boy, I spent a lot of time in the locker rooms around the teams and was always fascinated with the language coaches use with their players, specifically the pregame speech and the halftime speeches. Um, and just always gravitated towards what that was all about and the hoorah of the locker room and the excitement of the players and storming out onto the field, and it always just inspired me and intrigued me. Fast forward 25 years and I've got a decade or two of coaching experience under my belt, and I'm continuing to think about this idea of the language coaches use with players. And it occurred to me that in over 400 halftime speeches that I've given as a college head coach, I don't know if any of it makes any sense. I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason to what I'm saying. I don't know if there's any scientific evidence that shows that what I'm saying makes any sense or has any impact at all. And so that's the foundation and where this study was born. This idea of trying to figure out if the language we use at halftime as coaches has any meaningful impact under the umbrella of scientific research. Um, and so what I discovered quickly was that there's not a lot of research on halftime communication. And the reason is it's hard to get into locker rooms. It's hard to record data. It's hard to capture data of halftime language. It's a private space amongst coaches and players, and it's difficult to get in there to capture data. And so there's not a ton of research. There are a few studies that I'll touch on here. But generally, all of the studies that I found ultimately said the same thing, that more research is required. In addition, I also found this wonderful theory called motivating language theory. It's a theory about how leaders can communicate with their followers that's productive and effective, and has proven scientifically to if utilized, can increase engagement, can increase productivity, can increase attendance, can increase participation. But the theory had never been applied to the sports setting. It's been used in business, it's been used in aviation, it's been used in the healthcare industry, it's been used in the military, but the theory had never been used in athletics. So I found essentially two gaps. One, not a lot of research on halftime communication in general, and two, no research supporting motivating language theory in the athletic context. So this study and this research married those two ideas, and I'm happy to share some of those findings with you today. So again, the background of the study, multiple studies within the leadership literature have investigated leader communication through the lens of motivating language theory in the university setting, in the Philippines, in Japan, in corporate America, through the military, the aviation industry, in Mexico, in Australia. So it's a global theory that's been utilized in a lot of different industries, but as I mentioned, hasn't been utilized in the athletic arena. Okay, and then a little bit of background for the sports setting before we marry the two concepts. There's 1,873 sanctioned NCAA soccer programs in the United States. There's 49,000 plus NCAA soccer players in America. There's 1,800 NCAA head coaches here in America. There's 834 men's soccer programs here in the United States. NCAA soccer has been played for just over 60 years. And there are 0 studies that have explored NCAA head soccer coaches' halftime communication. Okay. And there are 0 studies that have explored it under the umbrella of motivating language theory. So I'm excited about the research. I think there's a lot that we can learn. Um, and I'm happy to share some of my findings. Okay, and then again, the gap in the literature pretty much explicitly states the same ideas. Studies pertaining to halftime settings need more exploration. Intermissions are largely unexplored in the coaching sciences. More research is required to assist sports psychologists and coaching staffs to develop and examine strategies to effectively use their halftime talks. Okay, and then finally, the bottom bullet point, historical research has examined motivating language, linguistics, coach communication, and halftime communication individually, but the evolution of the research hasn't explored these constructs collectively. Okay, and so that's where the marriage of both motivating language theory um, and halftime communication was born. So the purpose of the study was to explore specifically how NCAA head men's soccer coaches' halftime communication influence match outcomes through the lens of the three components of motivating language theory, which are empathetic language, meaning-making language, and direction-giving language. And what the heck do those mean? Well, empathetic language is just that. It's the ability of a leader to empathize and connect with others. Meaning-making language in the context of this theory is the intersection of follower talents with organizational goals, has a lot to do with culture, with meaning, with the philosophy of sport, the philosophy of life, sort of the bigger picture connections that coaches make with their players, specific to the real world and how sport connects to the real world. And then finally, the most common form of language under the umbrella of motivating language theory is direction giving language. That's the X's and O's. Uncertainty reducing language from leader to follower. It dominates most form of leader communication. And within the sport setting, again, that's the tactical piece, the X's and O's. So this study extends our understanding of motivating language theory in general, and it extends it specifically to the athletic arena. Okay, the 4 research questions that I looked at. Okay, ultimately, research question 1 is the main research question. How do NCAA head men's soccer coaches' halftime communication influence match outcomes under the umbrella of the 3 components of motivating language theory: empathetic language, meaning-making language, and direction-giving language? And then research questions 2, 3, and 4 specifically address each of the 3 components: empathetic language, meaning-making language, and direction-giving language. So I utilized, because I'm a single researcher with limited resources, I just utilized head men's soccer coaches. Okay, I utilized my background of NCAA soccer, where I've been a coach over the last 20 years. Obviously, I had site authorization and permission from the athletic departments and the coaches of the halftime speeches that I was able to record and the data I was able to collect. And my sample size was 10 NCAA head men's soccer coaches here in the United States. I used 4 sources of data. I interviewed the coaches talking about their language use. We recorded their actual halftime speeches, and then I coded those speeches using inductive and deductive coding to extract themes specific to motivating language theory, the 3 components. Obviously, we used the box scores of the games because we needed to see what the score at halftime was, and then we needed to see what the score of the final game was. And then I used the validated motivating language scale, where I asked the coaches to complete the scale, which has been vetted and validated extensively through other arenas that I mentioned earlier: aviation and business and the military. And so the scale has been applied to a lot of different industries. And what I did is I applied it specifically to the language that coaches used at halftime. So they completed the scale thinking only of the speech that they delivered and that we were examining. Okay, so I use deductive coding, I utilize thematic analysis, and ultimately the idea was to extract some themes, some qualitative themes to try to get a little bit better understanding of the types of language that use and how they correspond to whether a team wins or loses. So it was an exciting study, came up with some great findings, um, and really excited to share some of those themes with you. Again, to answer research question one, utilize the interview responses, the recordings, the halftime scores, the final scores, and then of course the completion of the motivating language scale. So those were my 4 sources of data. Here's a quick look at my 10 participants, a variety of all 3 divisions, as little as 2 years of head coaching experience, as many as 39 years of head coaching experience. So quite a spectrum of coaches. Now, it's important to note the findings of this study obviously are not conclusive. The sample size is entirely too small, to generate any causality or really any correlation. But it's a start. It's a beginning of a dialogue. It's a beginning to begin to examine this phenomenon of language and final match outcome. And excited about where the research might lead. Okay, the results. So what did I find? So I've collected all the data. We've examined the halftime speeches. We've recorded it. I've coded them. I was able to extract ultimately 8 major themes that emerged through the deductive and inductive coding. The deductive codes were the 3 pieces of motivating language theory. So I had an empathetic language category, a meaning-making language category, and a direction-giving language category. As my 3 deductive codes, and then I dumped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of inductive codes that I pulled from the interviews and from the halftime transcripts, and pulled those inductive codes and then grouped them into one of the 3 deductive codes. So here are my 8 major themes: 2 from empathetic language, 3 meaning-making language themes, and 3 direction-giving language themes. The 2 empathetic language themes that emerged from the data was a sense of understanding and addressing psychological and emotional conditions in the halftime speech. The meaning-making language themes that emerged from the speeches in the interviews were clarifying questions that coaches asked their players, metaphorical language and storytelling, which was a really interesting finding. In other words, directly stating a point without directly stating a point, and then addressing camaraderie and culture, sort of big picture things, not necessarily specific to the game at hand, but just team culture and team camaraderie in general. And then the direction-giving language themes that emerged, as you can imagine, tactical management, the X's and the O's, right? Very, very common. Communicative timing. When is instruction delivered? If a halftime is 15 minutes long, are instructions given in the first 5 minutes, the first 10 minutes, the last 5 minutes, the last 10 minutes? At what point during the intermission or the halftime is the instruction delivered? And then finally, modes of delivery. How is the information delivered? Is it verbal? Is it video? Is it chalkboard? Is it whiteboard? Is it magnets? Is it drawing? Is it utilizing little cones out on the field? And so that was a theme that emerged under the umbrella of the direction giving language deductive code piece. And this is what the data looked like. The percentages in terms of the frequency of the amount of language coaches used. And we won't go through this whole thing, but essentially in the 10 games of data that I collected, there was 4 wins, 3 losses, and 3 draws. And most interestingly were 3 of the 4 teams that won utilized empathetic language the most. Also, interestingly, 3 of the 4 teams that won used a combination of all 3 elements of motivating language theory the most. So they used direction giving, meaning making, and empathetic language in 3 of the 4 teams that won as an aggregate, more than teams that lost or drew a tie. So again, certainly not causal. Hard to even draw a correlation, but there's an interesting discussion that's beginning to happen in terms of some of these findings, with the understanding that there's a long way to go. But this is an interesting start, and I believe a good start in terms of beginning to look at how language scientifically connects to final match outcome. Okay, and then I'll just quickly go through the 8 themes with you and then briefly talk about theoretical, practical implications and then recommendations for the future. Theme number 1 under the umbrella of empathetic language, sense of understanding. Again, a coach's ability to relate to players, to walk in their shoes. And then I just provided a couple of quotes here for you. Things that were inductive codes that I pulled out of the data. Some of these are in vivo, direct quotes. Some of them are paraphrased, but you'll get an idea of what the themes look like and some of the language that was used to fall under that category. So it's tough out there. We have a lot of work to do. I know it's tough. I know it's disappointing. Get adjusted to the elements. The weather could play a factor. Okay. Theme number 2, under the umbrella of empathetic language, coaches addressing psychological and emotional conditions. And we define that as a coach's ability to identify, recognize, and address the emotional and psychological state of the players, again, specific to their halftime talk. Okay. Coaches told me that you've got to be in tune and have a pulse for your team. Another coach said, I try to use trigger words to get to their emotions. Another coach discussed they should be leaving halftime with a better mindset, which I loved. Okay, now we're moving into another research question where we're looking at meaning-making language. And the 3 themes there were clarifying questions, metaphorical language, and camaraderie and culture. Okay, clarifying questions under the umbrella of meaning-making language specific to a halftime speech, probing questions that check for understanding and clarity. And this was interesting because the coaches were asking their players for answers. They weren't hypothetical questions. So when they asked players, did you see what I was asking you to do? It was interesting. They waited for a response. These weren't hypothetical. Does that make sense? They waited for their players to answer yes or no. Any other problems that we need to deal with? Are we following that? Again, waiting for players to respond. So these clarifying questions, this data was extracted and was really interesting because it gave some insight into coaches ensuring that their players are actually listening and digesting what's happening collectively as a group. Metaphorical language, one of my favorite pieces to the halftime piece here, the data that showed, coaches use stories. And they were able to make a point without directly stating the point. Let's be lion tamers. Let's burn the boats. Be a blue collar team. Let's roll up our sleeves. So using this type of metaphorical language and storytelling to highlight an important point without directly stating the point. And then the final theme under the umbrella of meaning-making language was the idea of camaraderie and culture. Bigger picture items, the philosophy of life, and what is it we're trying to accomplish, and what is our goal here as a unit, as a group, as a team. Linking organizational purpose with a higher meaning. And then some of the quotes, some of the things that coaches shared with me. Team culture and team values are key drivers of performance. I want to promote the team culture and not add to the frustration. I really loved that. What is accepted and what is valued versus what is not accepted. Culture is the business of leaders, another coach told me. Team first, individual second. So again, some important points of information that was extracted from the data that we collected specific to this theme that falls under meaning-making language. Okay, and then moving into the final component of motivating language theory and specifically how it's connected to halftime speeches and game outcome, tactical management, the X's and the O's, communicative timing, and then modes of delivery. So I define tactical management, right, as the identification, adjustment, and correction of gameplay specific to the first half. Okay, and some of the pieces that of data that were extracted, coaches talking about clarity of instruction, exact directions to help them be successful. You can alter the shape of your team tactically. You can tactically make changes that you can't make on the field on the fly. Okay, and then timing, right? The time management of the halftime speech, when is information delivered? Finally, modes of delivery. Is it verbal? Is it on a whiteboard? Is it with markers? Is it magnets? Is it with cones? Right? The variety of ways in which a coach delivers the speech was an important component. Okay, the theoretical implications. Again, this extends our understanding of motivating language theory into the athletic arena, which has never been explored. This explores our understanding of halftime speeches and halftime communication. And then practical implications. This study introduces coaching professionals to motivating language theory and the three important components. Coaches can consider using the 8 qualitative themes within their own halftime speeches. Coaches can learn more about how motivating language theory applies to their own communicative approach and to their own delivery of halftime communication. And then finally, the study extends coaching methodology and helps soccer coaches all over the world analyze their own communication with players specific to halftime. Okay, and then finally, the last slide, recommendations for future research. Need to increase the sample size, perhaps use a quantitative methodology, perhaps use a quantitative methodology with a correlation or causal comparative research design. Right now, I'm collecting data using women's basketball coaches, so I'm excited about that. We've shifted sports and we've shifted genders. I'm also collecting data that looks at the language basketball coaches use during timeouts and how their team performs in the minute following the timeout. So super excited about that research. And then finally, recommendations for future practice. Leading U.S. soccer organizations could introduce this idea of motivating language theory to coaches in their coaching curriculum. Conventions could incorporate presentations about motivating language theory and how it might be used in the athletic arena, similar to this study. And then finally, sports psychology or sport management programs on college campuses could or should incorporate motivating language theory and halftime communication into their curriculum. And here at Nichols College, I've done that in a variety of my courses, specifically my coaching courses and my sport communication course. These are pieces that we study, MLT, and how coaches communicate with their teams. Those are some of my favorite activities to do with students. We actually ask them to write their own halftime speeches under the umbrella of MLT and deliver the halftime speeches to their peers, which is always a lot of fun. And that, my friends, concludes my presentation. And I think at this point, we can open it up to questions if anybody has any questions.
Thanks for that, Chris. That was excellent. All right, it looks like we've got some questions in the chat. Let me go ahead and take a look at these to share them with you. Ashley says, I have boys that play select baseball, and even at their very young ages, 6 and 7, I can certainly see the difference in how coaches speak and approach kids at this level versus other coaches. The mental aspect of this game is so important, and I think it's important for everyone, for every sport at every level, that could be studied more.
Absolutely. And baseball's interesting because you don't have halftime, you have innings. And we actually had this discussion the other day in one of my classes with my students about how do we get across our message as coaches in a baseball arena. And interestingly, hockey, for example, has 2 intermissions. And so how do you manage the 2 intermissions in hockey? And so there's still so much more research that can be done, but the baseball dynamic is super interesting because of the innings. And that dynamic is a lot different than other sports.
Yeah, great point. She also says in the comments, as a parent, do you recommend a book that can help with the mental hurdles of kids in sports?
You sure? There's a lot of great books out there. A lot of wonderful authors. Um, Motivating language theory is a good starting point. There's a wonderful article in the Harvard Business Review that really breaks it down and provides some examples of the different types of language that can be used. Dr. Jeremiah Sullivan, he's the founder of motivating language theory. He's written extensively on this. And then Jackie and Milton Mayfield, retired professors out of Texas and A&M, they've done a lot of extensive research, and they have some wonderful publications on the language coaches use under the umbrella of motivating language theory. Now, they haven't addressed it in the athletic arena; they've addressed it in other areas, but a lot of the information is transferable for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. We've got another question from Kyle. He says, how do you accurately measure the impact of motivating language theory on team performance and game outcomes, given there are many variables such as weather, referee decisions, and opposing team tactics that are unaffected by coaches' use of MLT?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. It's a great point. That's one of the weaknesses of the study for sure. There are uncontrollables and there are variables that are completely out of a coach's control and players' control for that matter. And that's one of the weaknesses. You could deliver the greatest halftime speech in the world using all the components of motivating language theory, and the referee could make a horrific decision and cause your team to lose through no fault of anybody's. And that's just kind of the way sports goes sometimes. So there are those intangibles and invariables that are an acknowledged weakness of studying this. But I think that aside, in general, if we begin to look at the big picture of the language that's used, I think there is a method to the madness. And I think as a whole, if as coaches and coaching professionals, we're aware of the language we use under this proven method, I think more times than not, we'll see relatively accurate results.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to consider when you do those quantitative theories if you can control for some of these variables. Like you said, you can't necessarily control for opposing teams' tactics, but you could control for weather or referee decisions, things like that.
And one of the other things I spent some time thinking about is home versus away,
Sure.
conference versus non-conference, right? Rival versus non-rival type games, and the emotional intensity, those subjective human emotions that play a role in sport, all really challenging scenarios to measure and to try to corral in a scientific setting. But all really fun things to think about and consider, and it's never really been studied, which is super cool. We've just got this. I've got 25 years of research ahead of me, Brett. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm gonna do my best to tackle it all.
That sounds awesome. We are out of time for today, so thank you, Dr. Christopher Streeter, for this great presentation. Thank you to our audience members for some great questions. We appreciate everybody being here.
Thank you, everybody.